Welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I'll be your host for today's show. I'm so glad you're able to join us and hear about the good news that your support is making possible. I'm especially glad that we're joined by one person in particular who made some of what we're talking about today especially possible over the course of the last year or so. And our guest today is a guest we've had on the show once or twice before, and many of you know, Robert Alt, CEO of the Buckeye Institute. Robert's here to talk about one of my favorite topics, federal overreach, and how Buckeye Institute's been taking this on in the courts. Robert, welcome back to the show. We're so glad you're back with us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. Great to be here.
Well, Robert, can you share a little bit more with us about how Buckeye's been taking on federal overreach and really just protecting Americans against this? Because it's not just this nebulous thing that happens, it's actually harming individuals across the country.
Absolutely. No, I mean, when you were in school and you learned about how it is that a bill becomes a law, or you watched Saturday morning cartoons, you'd see this story about, how it is Congress passes a law and then it gets implemented and so forth. And now in our everyday lives, oftentimes the things that impact us most, they may not actually ever go through Congress. It ends up being these unitary executive actions, particularly. I mean, how many of you watched the State of the Union address and you heard Biden talk about his priorities for the year? Almost none of them were legislation. There were things that he was planning on ramming through executive agencies. Yeah. Things like the OSHA vaccine mandate or student loan forgiveness. All these things are things where he just went ahead and did it alone. And so because of that, Buckeye has taken a very aggressive role on pushing back in the courts when the executive exceeds its authority, whether it was the OSHA vaccine mandate, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, or in student loan forgiveness, or any number of other issues where it impacts individuals and businesses across the country.
You're right, Robert. So many things are impacting individuals and business, and you can't talk about federal overreach without talking about the EPA. From what I understand, Buckeye has taken on the EPA in a very big lawsuit that made it to the Supreme Court. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. I'd say probably the biggest case in the Supreme Court that no one paid enough attention to last year was West Virginia versus EPA. And this was an attempt essentially to justify, or this was the administration's Clean Power Plan. It was an attempt to sort of change how it is that we do energy in this country from coast to coast. And this was something that, once again, the agency was doing it on its own. EPA was exceeding the authority that Congress had given it. So Buckeye went to court, and we showed the impact it would have on Ohioans. 9,000 direct job losses, 32,000 indirect job losses. And subsequent to this, we also went ahead and did studies showing just the absolute enormous cost it would have on families. So the Supreme Court went ahead, they took a look and found that this violated the law, the way that they were implementing this. And it really created a precedent that I think we'll be able to use to push back against excessive use of federal power. Something the theory is the major question doctrine, but sort of breaking it down into plain English. Look, there are issues that are so big. We're not just going to assume that these federal agencies have the authority to do it if Congress hasn't given them the authority.
So you talk about how that clearly impacted people in Ohio, and it was precedent setting. So can you talk more specifically, how might that impact me here in South Carolina in the future?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this would have been absolutely devastating to you. Unfortunately, the Biden administration is continuing to try and implement this on a piecemeal fashion. And so it's not enough to simply win the day in court. You have to actually continue to press back against these kinds of abuses. And so Buckeye is leading a charge and trying to work with other SPN groups across the country in putting comments to stop the new regulation. But yeah, I mean, these are the sorts of things that are going to drive up your energy bill, and in the long run may in fact impact the sorts of energy that you have available to you.
Thanks, Robert. That's good to know. And it just goes to show how this work that you do and that this network is doing, it's never over. We always continue this fight. We can never rest, no matter how many victories we get under our belt. So let's shift gears for a moment. I know that Buckeye has represented several clients who've experienced specific abuses of power by the federal government. I'm going to toss out a few names to you. We can play the word association game. Can you tell us the stories of these folks who you guys have represented and you found justice for them? The first that we've seen in the news quite a bit, Eric Flannery. Tell us about Eric and how you've helped Eric.
Absolutely. Eric is a great guy. He is a Navy veteran who owns a family bar, sort of a neighborhood bar on Capitol Hill. And during the pandemic, he was holding on by his fingertips. I mean, DC had some of the most abusive regulations, long shutdowns. And then when he was finally allowed to reopen, you could only have a small percentage of the space occupied. So he literally burnt through his life savings, just trying to keep his dream alive, keep his business going. And then DC, to add insult to injury, said, you know what, we're going to force you to check vaccine IDs of everyone who comes into your bar. And that was it. That was just a step too far for him. As he noted, he doesn't have any background in checking medical records. You know, he's running a bar. That's not what he was seeking to do. So he posted a tweet, the day before the regulation came in, and all it said was, everyone is welcome. Everyone is welcome. That should be the goal for any business, that they're welcoming to all comers. And for this, DC came down on him like a ton of bricks. 3 separate agencies, they sent undercover agents into his bar to catch him not checking IDs. They pulled every license that he had, shut him down. And the sad thing is, Eric could not find help in DC. Ultimately, we had friends who lived on Capitol Hill who went into his bar. He told them about the problem, and they knew about what Buckeye had done on the OSHA vaccine mandate and how we'd been able to push back effectively against the federal government and said, this is the lawyer you need to talk to. So ultimately, Buckeye stepped in. We've been able to get his bar reopened, push back against all the agency overreach there, and we've got a pending lawsuit against DC government for their abuses.
Wow. Okay. Tell us about Josh Shad.
So another story of the pandemic. The old story, there's only 2 things guaranteed in life, death and taxes. And the pandemic.
That's sad, by the way, but okay.
It is unfortunate, but when it comes to the government, I think that ultimately is true. During the pandemic, we went through a shutdown here in Ohio, like most states did. It literally was a crime during the shutdown if you weren't an essential employee, if you stepped foot in your office. You could be fined $500. You could be sent to jail for 6 months. But the cities were relying upon commuter tax revenue, and they still wanted to tax those individuals as if they were stepping foot in their office, as if they were working in the office during that time. It was kind of something out of George Orwell. We're going to criminally punish you if you step in your office, but we're going to pretend that you were in your office to tax you more. So Josh Shad was one of these folks. He didn't live in the city of Cincinnati, but his business was there, and they tried to tax him as if he'd been working in the city when he hadn't been. So we've taken his case all the way up to the Ohio Supreme Court on this very basic principle that you can't tax based upon make believe. And we are waiting to hear from the court right now on that case.
That's outstanding. And finally, in terms of just cases that impact real people and will matter through all the states, give us your favorite or most compelling case you think that has to do with government unions that you guys have been working on.
Oh, there are a lot of good cases on that. I mean, right now we actually have been filing a number of lawsuits because it's unfortunate. The Janus case came down, and as we all know, this was a huge victory for workers across the country. It said that you could no longer be forced to pay union dues to support views with which you disagree. And the unfortunate thing is the unions have just been absolutely recalcitrant. They have not adhered to it. People will go ahead. We get contacted all the time by employees who say, you know what, I don't want to be part of the union anymore. Please, stop withholding dues. I'm resigning from the union. and they don't honor that. And so we actually have a series of cases right now. One, we were representing, I think, more than a dozen different clients. We did get the union to settle on a number of them, but it's interesting. We've got a number of clients where they still, even though they've resigned from the union, even though they're legally obligated to stop withholding dues, they won't do it. And part of it, I think, quite frankly, this is where what Buckeye does is so important, because it evens the odds. I mean, I think, unfortunately, the unions know that if it's just an individual sending in a letter, they can go ahead and stonewall them, and they can keep on collecting that money. It takes Buckeye, the threat of Buckeye taking them into court and forcing them to comply with the law to actually get these people the enjoyment of the rights that they deserve, that they shouldn't be forced to support views they disagree with. So I'm very proud of what we've been able to do. We've gotten scores of individuals relief and gotten them their money back, and we're continuing to fight aggressively there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those 3 stories. I know we could spend all day doing story time with you, Robert. Tell us a little bit, for those who don't know as much about this. We hear about national, big private firms on the national stage, but this rise of state-based litigation centers coming to the national stage. Tell us how you feel the role of Buckeye and others who have really popped up in recent years. What's different about the role of Buckeye versus some, other firms that are out there? Why is what you do so important versus, what a different firm would be doing?
Well, what comes to mind, I was sitting down the other day at a friend who I used to work with in DC, come to visit, and she was choked up at the fact that during the pandemic, you had all these big national firms, you had all these big national think tanks that were in DC, and you look at something like the Flannery case, and they didn't push back. They didn't push back against the regulations, and I don't know why. I think part of it might have been, quite frankly, they were in DC and of DC, and I think that they were afraid of sticking their head up because the government might go after them if in fact they were doing that. So interestingly enough, I think that Buckeye played a particularly special role there because we weren't in the swamp. We weren't in DC. And when you had these problems arise, we were able to push back aggressively and to do so in a way that, quite frankly, the national groups just weren't willing to do. I mean, I think the other thing that you see is that, we're very much more connected with businesses and individuals in the community. You take a look at something like the OSHA vaccine mandate. So Buckeye was at the cutting edge of that litigation. We were the first to seek an injunction against it. In the lower courts, we were the first to ask the Supreme Court to go ahead and strike it down and give us an injunction. We did so based on great plaintiffs we had. And these are plaintiffs who we knew. We knew them because they were in Ohio, they were in the community, folks like Angela, who runs a business here. She does specialty welded pipe. And she's so concerned about her employees that she, out of her own generosity, had gone ahead and done antibody testing for all of her employees to be able to demonstrate, which of them had natural immunity. And so that when these regulations came into effect, she could push back and say, look, we've got all these people, they don't need to be vaccinated. They're able to demonstrate, we actually have the hard facts that these individuals, they already have immunity from the virus. None of that mattered to the federal government. It was just whether or not you complied with this regulation. And Buckeye was well positioned because we had those pre-existing relationships. So I think being in the community, knowing and having those contacts with individuals who are, they're the real heroes. They're the people who are running their businesses and trying to keep things going in spite of the government regulations. And we're able to tell their stories effectively in the courts and get those changes to happen.
You make a really good point. This network and the people fighting within this network are not in DC, and that's what makes it so magical. I think that's why a lot of our supporters are so inspired by what's happening here. It's also a reason why earlier this year in the spring, SPN launched our Center for Practical Federalism because we saw an opportunity to leverage that power of the network, to harness it and fight back against federal overreach in a way that some of the groups who are in DC, I think, have some trouble maybe hitting certain levers that the state groups are able to come together and do. And you're a part of that in partnership with us on some litigation efforts. Can you speak a little bit to some of your partnership with the Center for Practical Federalism and some of the work you're doing to fight the administrative state?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the Center for Practical Federalism, they're putting together a great tracker, which takes a look. I mean, I mentioned previously the Biden administration, how much we're seeing coming down in regulations, how much we're seeing, every day where it's not really going through legislation. And we need to be able to actually go ahead and as a movement, provide comments to these regs to try and prevent them from being enacted to begin with, and making sure that we're on record. It becomes part of the litigation strategy to have these objections in the record. So one, so being able to track that. Two, you frequently have, when things do go through Congress, they go ahead and put, hide restrictions, strings attached to the money. And so part of it is shining a light on that. And so the tracker will do that as well. And really, Buckeye then has been able to push back in court when these strings are unlawful, when in fact these requirements, a key example is under the American Rescue Plan Act, one of these multi-trillion-dollar bills. Congress went ahead and put in a restriction that said, if you take the money as a state, you can't cut taxes. They basically, ended up running roughshod over the state's ability to set their own tax policy. So Buckeye has filed briefs in multiple courts based upon the unlawfulness of that requirement. And that's another case. I mean, stay tuned. I think that one is destined to end up in the United States Supreme Court.
Great. Robert, what else do you want people to know before we let you go? I know you're a busy man and we appreciate the time that you've given us today.
Well, I just think, this is just such an important topic, of federal overreach. And it's something where I think that this is perhaps the most leveraged opportunity we have right now. The courts actually, I think, are primed to push back against federal abuses, probably more so than any time in our lifetime. And you have an administration that seems hell-bent on pushing the edge of the envelope. So, this is something where Buckeye sees this as probably the great opportunity for the next couple of years, at least, to bring these cases aggressively in court. And so again, keep your eye on Buckeye's litigation list, because we plan on bringing as many and as good of cases as we can to make the case for limited government.
There is no doubt about that. Well, thank you, Robert, for sharing these stories and all the work that you and your team have done. Thank you to those of you watching. I know you've made this and so much more possible. Please join us in 3 weeks. We will be in Chicago for SPN's annual meeting, and we will be coming to you from Chicago with more stories of what you're making possible on the ground with 1,700 of our closest friends and supporters. We'll see you there. Thanks again.